committee that Jaron and Ijen have been on to try to push Eric to finish not just the pamphlet, but also the book of the 21 principles of revolutionary organizing. So to me, the article, the pamphlet, makes a number of important points. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but a couple that stood out for me was first, that a transformative organization has confidence that its radical politics have mass impact. And to me, that was really important to hear, because I think all too often I have conversations with organizers or members of organizations who sort of have these very progressive left politics independently, but then when they go in and do their organizing, they all of a sudden have this justification as to why it is that they can't talk about socialism, or why it is that they can't talk about why it is important to end the war and how that relates to a campaign for environmental justice, for example. It's as if we begin to distrust the people that we're organizing with, that they're not making the connections about what's going on in the world. To me, one of the most important points that comes out of this pamphlet is that we have a high level of trust in the people that we're organizing. That people actually see the possibility of a better world and they want to make those connections. So I think it raises to me then sort of a big question that I think comes up later on in the panel, or in the pamphlet, and I think it raises a question for all of us. Eric makes this point that at certain moments in history, dedicated organizations of thousands can be joined by millions seemingly overnight, right? And all of us have this experience where thousands of people were organizing for immigrants' rights long before 2006. But then on May Day, there was this massive influx into the streets where people were putting out incredibly militant demands. And a lot of times people were like, I don't know where people came from. Like, they're not members of our organization. They're not, you know, on our email list. How did they find out about this? And I think it becomes a critical question for us to figure out what are those breaks in history and in society where we can open up the floodgates so that millions of people take to the streets. But then when they take to the streets, what do we need to do to prepare ourselves so that they stay a part of our organizations and continue to engage in the fight, not just around a particular reform, but ultimately to transform the entire society? A question that I have for Eric then is, what are the steps in which individuals and communities become radicalized? I think that there is an incredible faith, again, in this point that Eric makes, that our politics, radical politics, can have a mass impact. But right now, our politics are not hegemonic. They're not the norm. And so it raises a real question, even as the organizers are being transformed, even as the leaders of our organizations are being transformed, radicalized, and able to see through the mask of the system, what is the process in which we begin radicalizing the community? So that those politics that are these politics become the norm as we walk in our communities. The last point that I wanted to make is that I think that ultimately an addition that, Eric, you might want to think about for the pamphlet is the inclusion of transformative survival projects or transformative liberation zones. People probably know the history of the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, where the Portuguese dictatorship was desperate to hold on to its colonies. And Guinea-Bissau in West Africa being one of the principal colonies, the Portuguese government wound up dropping more bombs on this small country than the United States wound up dropping on Vietnam. over the course of that struggle. They were desperate to hold on to this colony. And the PAIGC, the liberation organization in Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, waged this amazing struggle against the Portuguese government. And Amilcar Cabral, who my son is named after, ultimately said, we're going to build these liberated zones. We're going to build these places where ultimately people not only begin to see themselves in opposition to the Portuguese government, but they ultimately begin to see themselves as the architects of a new society. They are ultimately in control of how it is that the world works. I think ultimately, as we're building organizations, it's critical that we engage in a process of standing in clear opposition to the US empire. But it is also critical for us to begin building the skills that people will need to ultimately govern. And so ultimately, in the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC was actually in a point where they knew they were going to militarily win against the Portuguese. And Cabral said, we don't want to smash them yet. We don't want to kick them out. Even in the midst of all of the atrocities that they're committing, even in the midst of all of the violence that they're perpetrating on us, we're not ready yet to govern. And I think it requires an incredible level of discipline to say that we are going to create zones where our people are developing those skills. And there are already building blocks that we have throughout the United States with workers' co-ops and community gardens and all of these things. But we have to figure out a way in which we're melding those together so that people see those as the building block for the new society.
Up next, I want to remind our speakers, we have 8 minutes, right? So up next is Cindy Weisner, who's an organizer with the Grassroots Global Justice. And Cindy spends a lot of her time thinking about how do all of our local organizations or our regional organizations actually build up to form alliances that make international links, that think about our struggle in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Louisiana, really connect so that we understand we're part of a global struggle. So in that context, Cindy, I'd like you to take a dive on some of those questions.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I didn't think I would make it to a workshop, so this is good. This is good. So I want to just really thank Eric and folks at the Labor Community Strategy Center and the Bus Riders Union for, in a lot of ways, really holding down the importance of theory and practice that then transforms into praxis. And I feel in a lot of ways, you know, coming up, I've been in the movement and started organizing when I was, you know, 18 years old, and in a lot of ways, so it's been a little bit more than, you know, almost 20 years now that we've been trying to figure this out. You know, we've been trying to figure out how is it that we actually build a base and build a strength in the working class, particularly of color, but then have our ability to be relevant and actually win some concrete demands and make changes in our lives, but also make history. And part of that process and trying to figure that piece out has a lot to do with how we actually understand how change happens. And how is it that we understand how to diagnose the problem? And how is it that we understand once we have a diagnosis of the problem, what do we do? And how do we do it? And with whom, right? And some of these questions in our movement are, in the organizing that I've done, people don't want to talk about it, right? And in fact, we've been like slapped on the hand, slapped on the face, be told to shut up, because in a lot of ways they say, you know, that left ideology or that method of analysis, whether you're Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, you know, Morales, you know, you know, at this point, how is it that, you know, we're actually really being rigorous about how we understand the world if we actually want to transform it? And I think that for me, that's been one of the contradictions, right? And when I started organizing, I came into the labor movement. And that's how I cut my teeth, right? That's how I actually learned how to be an organizer. And I will always credit being taught the numbers, right? Because you have to be about actually making those, like doing those house calls, getting those contacts, building up your list, following up, having systems in place, right? And I will always credit, to me, that basis and that foundation. I will always credit also the anarchist movement, right? Because I actually learned, that's how I actually cut my teeth in the streets. And we were in 1989 fighting against the cops in Berkeley, throwing stuff back. I think that for me, like having that understanding that we were throwing stuff back at the cops was like an incredible mind shift. And to me, I always credit that in my own development, right? Of what it meant to say that we actually have the ability as people to see cops reverse, right? When they see masses of folks coming forward. And to me, that was very incredible. But I also very much credit the revolutionary organizing process and collective that I was a part of in the Bay Area, an organization called STORM, that some of us were a part of. And I think in a lot of ways, we've been at different points in the movement made, people have been critical, right, of the role of a revolutionary organization and what its role for us and how it is that we ended up then relating to our mass work. And so I think that to me, this question about transformative organizing model, or what I've called revolutionary organizing model, is how is it that we're actually holding these different pieces together about understanding the world and what it is that needs to be done. Number two, how is it that we're building organization of the class, not only on a mass level, but also on a revolutionary level? Number three, how is it that we honor and say we are about leadership development? And not just leadership development about tactically, about how to do a press conference or how to do a door knock. Those are absolutely critical foundational development for any organizer. But it's actually how do you actually are doing that work to actually have that transformative critical consciousness moment of development, that aha moment that a lot of us have in our own growth, right, as revolutionaries and organizers. And the point around it, and how do we also figure out how to work with forces outside of ourselves, right? Because many times we get really comfortable just working with who we feel comfortable with, who we feel safe, who we have political alignment. And I think one of the critical pieces about transformative organizing within the United States, if we want to be relevant, we have to be able to build outside of ourselves and have what I call the roots deep, but also wide. And I think that's the hypothesis that I think we've been trying to figure out how to do in this last period. And the last thing is around counter-hegemonic demands. And I think that what Eric and the folks at the Labor Community Strategy Center really begin to put out is how is it that we put out not just demands about, sort of this is what we want to win, a living wage job, or we want to win this particular concrete material benefit for just us. But it's like, how do you actually put out demands that doesn't sell out another community or doesn't basically compromise you for the long term? And it's not about, and I think, but it's not to say that we are utopian, but it's about how are you actually understanding what it means to build with community and then understand how you transform those relationships with the people you're trying to build with outside of ourselves, but then at the same time, in the end, we move or advance our struggle, right? Because my gain and we win this thing, but then in the end, I've lost a lot of our allies. That's not a win. And how do we define wins is very important to think through. So there's a couple of chapters in the pamphlet that I want to just lift up. That I think that to me, this piece that a lot of us historically and generationally have been saying is that change will not happen without the most exploited and the most impacted, right? But I think to me, what I want to add to it is that we absolutely need to be able to do the critical consciousness work and build that class leadership. And so at first, and to quote a piece that Eric wrote, you know, at first many of us who do organizing, whether it's labor organizing, community organizing, in issue or sectoral organizing, we come to folks and it's, quote, at first we meet somebody as a garment worker, a bus rider, a farm worker, who may decide to get involved in a social movement. But then the process is to basically change them from an observer to an activist, and from an activist to an organizer. And that is what our task is, right? And that is what we all of us have been committed to doing, but it's like the process of what you do and what is that methodology of doing that. The second thing that I think is interesting and worth bringing up is that for us, the transformative organizing model, many times in our movement, we talk about actually erasing or invisibilizing the organizer. And I actually think that's a problem. I actually think it's a problem because it avoids accountability. It masks, it actually masks really how we run things in organizations. And I think it doesn't actually push us. And so for me, you know, I've struggled with this piece around what does it mean on a very personal level, right? To be doing this work and be accountable. And I consider myself as a product of the working class struggle, right? And my mother's a domestic worker, an immigrant, grew up in Los Angeles, got to college because of affirmative action. I barely made it through school, I never graduated, and then I basically became an organizer, right? And in a lot of ways, that's the story. That's a lot of the people we develop, and that's a lot of people we work in, right? The countless, and this is ultimately what we want. But at the same time, we can't negate that if I'm a product, or many of us are products of the class, we can't negate our role because isn't this what we're fighting for, right? And so part of it is that in the movement, we have a serious problem with leadership and acknowledging leadership and also accountability. And I think that that's something that we need to really contend with. The last thing that I want to say is that, to me, ultimately, I think we are in the biggest crisis that we have been. And I think that there's a real threat from the right wing. And I think that there's a real serious urgency around how it is that we, what is it that we need to be doing, and then how, and with whom. And I think that, to me, there's a real need for us to really do some self-reflection, and I think I agree with that piece. It's like, for me, even this process of the social forum, you know, it's like, where are we as a movement? What have we been able to win in the last 10 years? Have we really challenged neoliberalism? Have we been able to influence in this phase as we build our force? Did we build our independent force as we made sure that we protected from the making sure that Obama got elected because we saw the bigger threat from the right wing, right? With McCain and Palin, imagine them in office at this moment. How are we relating to those growing forces that are rising up independently, right? How is it that we're building organization? How are we internationalizing our perspective and movement? And so I just think, and how is it that we're actually dealing with the ecological devastation and urgency that we're in at this moment? And so I think that there's some pretty huge questions out there that I think on a lot of levels need transformative answers and solutions. And so for us, I think those of us who've been trying to really figure out this revolutionary organizing model that's grounded in the work, that has a method of analysis that understands we have to make change and have strategy and tactics, but at the same time that we actually begin at this moment to say what it is that we want and what concretely are those alternatives, right? And not just basically saying that we're going to transplant what happens around the world and have it here, but it's how do we actually take features of it and adapt it to the conditions that we're in. So with that, one of the questions that I have for Eric, and one of the things that I feel is important to develop, is that there is a question about sort of, we talk about change on multiple levels, but I think where the pamphlet needs some work is on the analysis of gender and patriarchy, and how do we understand interpersonal change in the process and the contradictions that we face in our communities, and how do you end up, how do we end up really thinking through those models, those transformative models. So thank you.
Speakers are so good, I'm getting liberal on the time. So the next person we have up is Netha Maina. He's a executive director of social justice leadership, and you know, I spent a year in the somatics and social justice collaborative, really thinking deep around the theory around transformative organizing in another in kind of a related area, but if you guys want to dive into it, social justice leadership put out a pamphlet called Transformative Organizing Towards Liberation of Self and Society. Right? And some of you may have been to transformative organizing 101, 102s that they're holding, right? So this question that Cindy has of how do you actually go deeper and transform self, and what does that look like when looking out and thinking about it in the direction towards where we want society. And so in that, I would like Netha to address the crowd.
Thanks.
Woo.